All right, so thanks for joining me talking about some biomarkers, specifically biomarkers that are used to identify a level of fatigue or muscle damage in the field. I'm highly interested in taking the lab outdoors, and this is the next mechanism that will allow us to identify some threshold or some conversion into the mechanical nature of running when it's hit a muscle damage or fatigue concept. We'll go quickly over some traditional biomarker methods and then into some of the new biomarker methods, which I'm kind of really excited that I stumbled upon during this project that I can use in my dissertation. So to begin, let's quickly talk about fatigue and the scary topic of fatigue in my lab, and that's because it's so complex in nature. Fatigue is known as a multifaceted concept. It could be peripheral, it could be localized, and it could be from a reduce in or inability to convert ATP, or just because you have muscle damage, or because your mindset's just not there and you're looking someplace else. The true definition from a mechanical perspective or an exercise perspective is a decrease in force or power or exercise intensity. And this decrease is all known with a response to contractile activity of the muscle itself, right? So I'm looking more towards the peripheral components, so how the muscle contracts and produces movement of the skeletal muscle system. So I'm going to argue that there's actually a better way to refer to this mechanism, and it's more about what is actually occurring. So instead of using fatigue, we would use concepts as neuromuscular function deficit or decrease, or we would use oxidative stress, or majority of what I'm interested in the biomarkers of I suggest later on in this presentation are muscle damage. So what happens when we have some localized skeletal muscle damage? And so for me, instead of fatigue, I would use those terminologies instead, because now it's really referring to what is of interest. All right, so let's talk about what a biomarker actually is. And there's some requirements that need to be satisfied for something to be classified as a biomarker. Some of those are the relationship between the measurements and the process are linear. There is a continuous change in the process that's represented. It can be accurately measured. It's detectable in measurable amounts and can be easily accessible in bodily fluids, but we'll talk a little bit about something that doesn't have to be measured in bodily fluid. And most importantly, with reference to markers of exercise-induced muscular fatigue, the marker cannot further induce fatigue, and that's a very strong and important concept going forward. So the type of biomarkers, and as you look at these pictures here, for a long time, since I've been looking at biomarkers and interested in biomarkers, since Dr. Navalta has become active at UNLV, I thought biomarkers were only representative of what you see here, and that's some kind of protein or enzyme within the blood that indicates something changing within the environment or something is present in the environment. But so as we look at the types of biomarkers for exercise-induced muscular fatigue, and after this fatigue concept we just talked about, we're going to stick with this for now because this is what they've talked about. In most of the literature out there, they talk about exercise-induced muscular fatigue, and they go fatigue from neuromuscular all the way to oxidative stress, down to skeletal muscle damage. And so for our purposes, the dry markers, which are truly what we've been doing as biomechanists for a long time in exercise physiologists, and that's things like counter movement jump or torque production in an isokinetic machine, or force production in the laboratory. These all are types of neuromuscular functioning that we measure and see if there's a decrease or a deficit. To go further, skeletal muscle damage is more the serum levels in the saliva or the urine samples that are traditionally known for biomarkers. We're going to focus on some that are serum coming up here for our skeletal muscle damage, but we'll talk about more of those here in a short second. The ones of most interest to me is going to be creatine kinase and myoglobulin, as you'll see in a minute. But here we go, some examples of what we just talked about. Here you have an example of a force production during a counter movement jump. Maybe foreign to a lot of you. John Harry knows this quite well. But here we have that flat line in the middle there that's at zero. That's 0 newtons on the y-axis. That's the aerial phase. And what research tended to do is they'll look at that little pre-phase there and see the max effort prior to leaving the ground and that's what they call the force production to create the jump impulse. And they either might integrate that to find out the jump impulse, or they might just pick that max value at 2,000 to see if that actually decreases or not. So that's a way of testing that neuromuscular function. If there's a decrease in either those jump impulse or that max effort, then you may see a decrease. Also, that impact peak there at the end when they land, if that increases or decreases, that may be also be representative of some kind of neuromuscular function decrease. Here's more about what I propose and what I'll be proposing hopefully here coming up soon. And this is a combination of a pacing chart versus two biomarkers measured serum-wise for localized peripheral muscular damage. That chart there that has the red, blue, and green, that is a pacing chart of the Boston Marathon for every mile. Let's take red, for example. Red's the one on top. It's the actual slowest of the three athletes, but it's also somebody who shows the greatest, in my opinion, decline of what I would say prior to mile 22. There's what appears to be some kind of fatigue or tiring happening. Muscular damage is what I would term it as if I were doing the study. But at 22, they increase that speed drastically for the last 4 miles. So now looking at retrospectively, they were conserving some energy for the end. And they didn't develop that. But I could use the biomarker to measure what sort of, compare red and blue and see which one had a greater deal of muscular damage from the way that you look on the two graphs on the left. So the top is myoglobulin and the bottom is creatine kinase. Now this is total creatine kinase. It's important here to note that creatine kinase does have 5 isozymes, 3 of which we're going to talk about, one of which we talk about really, that's the MM, which is going to be the skeletal muscle. They also measure the MB, which is reserved for cardiac heart damage, muscle damage, and they subtract that to see if the total CK and that combined together, then it may be not related to skeletal muscle, but maybe cardiac damage. But if you look at those two graphs, immediately post, there's a huge spike and you see the peak in myoglobulin. And the creatine kinase takes a day for it to peak. So the proposed is that you combine these two, so you get the overall. If I just measured CK or creatine kinase immediately after, I may miss the extent of that muscle damage, where myoglobulin tells me there is a good extent of that, and then I can see it post cessation of exercise 6 to 24 hours in the creatine kinase. So the current literature that I reviewed, they really deal with endurance races anywhere from 21 kilometers on up to 136 kilometers or 100-mile century run in California, which is a crazy intense ultra endurance run. But they measured a combination of total creatine kinase and then also that creatine kinase MB, which is the heart functioning. But in general, all these races above 21K saw an increase in the creatine kinase, and the creatine kinase shows an increase in intensity and duration. So that's why these long endurance runs see this increase. But it's important to note that the creatine kinase is a delayed response. So it's important to include that secondary marker, myoglobin. Also, they used lactate dehydrogenase as one of theirs as well. The training status of those partaking in the runs or those training have a increased resting serum level, and that's because creatine kinase not only has a delayed response, but it also removed from the serum at a slower rate as well. So with continued repetitive damage to the peripheral skeletal muscle, you have that increased resting serum level. And this is shown too in a detraining study where they detrained for 3 weeks. They saw that these people who were highly trained decreased their resting serum levels of creatine kinase, and that's the total concentration level there. But again, it's important in combining these biomarkers, and not only wet biomarkers, but also the dry. So whether you're using some kind of pacing chart, or you use the force production, or a torque production, it's also important to combine the two to kind of get an overall mindset on where this localized peripheral damage is coming from, or if it's strictly neuromuscular in nature. One of the other things that they note is that CK or creatine kinase is also related to the DOMs, right? So people who or self-report immediately after the race that perceive DOMs, or a day after or 2 days after, those that have the elevated perception of DOMs actually have that elevated serum level of creatine kinase as well. So, you know, I'm excited. This is an example of where the biomarkers of the future are going. And I look forward to further investigating the extent of what creatine kinase, myoglobulin, and its counterparts can tell me with muscular damage and fatigue measurements outdoors. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy your summer.